Let me thank and acknowledge His Excellency the High Commissioner of Rwanda to Kenya, and also acknowledge the diplomats here present from different countries, and to acknowledge my very good friend and the Vice Chancellor of the University of Nairobi, which is my alma mater, the senior academics here present, and also permit me to acknowledge the very distinguished panelists who are present here and whose contribution you will hear shortly. Permit me also to acknowledge the members of the Pan-African Institute, which is hosted at the Kenya University, but which has been expanding. And it is in that spirit that I acknowledge Zakaria from Unity University in Hargeisa, which houses a Pan-African Institute which is mentored from Kenya. It is also important to appreciate that we have another institute in Eden University in Lusaka, Zambia, and that in the month of June, we will be having our 4th institute in Monrovia in Liberia, and in October the 5th at the University of West Indies in Trinidad and Tobago. Before we get into the lecture, and in appreciation of the solemnity of the occasion at which we are present, it would be remiss on my part if for only 30 seconds I did not invite you to stand up and reflect on what happened 32 years ago. You may resume your seats. We are gathered here 32 years since the genocide against the Tutsi in Rwanda. And we are gathered here not because it is an annual jamboree at which we congregate and make speeches to ourselves. We are gathered here because history has taught us that if we are not careful, the only thing that we learn from history is that we learn nothing from history. We are gathered here at a time when in the realm of international law, many are asking themselves whether international law is dead or dying. We are gathered here at a time when we assumed that international law would have been settled and that we would not be seeing what I characterized as schizophrenic and epileptic actions on the part of countries that are meant to be the guarantors of international law. We are gathered here at a time when we see signs of genocide or genocidal activities taking place in different parts of the world. Many of you here will remember that this continent has known many activities which have dehumanized our sons and daughters. Many years ago, nearly half of the population of the continent of Africa was taken away to distant parts of the world, dehumanized, humiliated. Yet, not so long ago, at the United Nations when the world was called upon to declare that slavery was a crime against humanity. There are countries which had the audacity, or is it the effrontery, to vote against it and to be neutral, knowing that in times such as those, to be neutral is to endorse evil. That is the world in which we live. We are gathered here to remind ourselves that aside from slavery, our continent was rudely divided in Berlin in 1884 and 1885. And that it is that partition of the continent of Africa which one may say was the genesis of the genocide that we see today. Communities were divided into spheres of influence. Families were divided. Families were disaggregated. And they were poisoned against each other. We are reaping the dividends of those diabolical actions of the colonialists. But we also know that during that very period, this continent perhaps witnessed the first genocide in the continent of Africa, the genocide of the Herero and the Nama by the Germans in what is present-day Namibia. It is good that the Germans have acknowledged and offered to pay reparations. We are gathered here also, and history reminds us that during the Second World War, the Jews were victimized. And it is only then that the international community woke up. And in 1948, we had the Genocide Convention. We believed then that the world would never see any other genocide. But we were deluding ourselves, because it would appear that man has the capacity to do good, but man also has the capacity to perpetrate and perpetuate evil of untold proportions. When therefore we started seeing the signs of genocide in Rwanda, it was not in 1994. It was earlier. In the 1950s, kingdoms were being disturbed and individuals were being dislocated, and they found refuge in different parts of the continent of Africa. They grew up in refugee camps. Decolonization came. They went back to their countries. They made promises to themselves, and they thought that they had immunized themselves from atrocities. Little did they know that what was not meant to happen would happen. When the League of Nations died, and in her place, the United Nations was created in San Francisco in 1945, the world thought that it had reordered herself, that there would be no other war. When in 1948, the Universal Declaration of Human Rights came into force, the world thought that pain would never be visited by man against man. When in 1949, the Geneva Conventions came into force in Geneva, Switzerland, we thought that nothing of that nature would happen again. When the protocols of 1966 came, we thought that it would never happen again. When the African Charter on Human and People's Rights came into force in the 1980s, we thought that we had immunized ourselves. But little did we know that in the minds of man, evil was being manufactured. So, we watched the United Nations in all its splendor was present in Rwanda, purportedly keeping peace. Beautiful speeches were being delivered in different parts of the world. The signs were there. Radio, television, music calling was alive and well. Men were called cockroaches. The world watched. East Africa watched. Africa watched. The big powers of the world with their nuclear weapons watched. The United Nations watched. For 100 days, the world watched. For 100 days, the world was eloquent in its silence. For 100 days, neighbors rose against neighbors, husbands against wives. Places of worship, which ought to be places of refuge, were turned into slaughterhouses. The world knew what ought to be done, but the world was paralyzed. We did nothing. When the evildoers had done their thing, estimates may vary, but anything between 800,000 and 1 million were dead. Dead and gone. Those who survived sought refuge elsewhere. Some of them are present here. The scars, the wounds are alive and well. Some have been immortalized in books and films. But yet, we live at a time when denialism and revisionism is with us. As we remember those days, there are those in the world, in Rwanda, and in the neighborhood who say there was no genocide. Amnesia, selective memories. And it is our duty on an occasion such as this to remind ourselves and to remind the world that the agenda of the perpetrators of the genocide is still alive and well, because in their mind the job was not completed. That is why we gather every year to remind ourselves that if we choose to consign this thing to the museums of history, then it will be repeated again. On an occasion such as this, we must ask ourselves a number of questions. Why is it that only 32 years later, we are choosing to forget? Why is it that after only 32 years, we are revising history? Why? Is it because the perpetrators were not punished? We are aware that the international community, having been absent during the critical times, came back. And in order to atone for their sins, they created the tribunal at Rwanda. The tribunal that was based in Arusha with the sole purpose of dealing with the perpetrators. Cost the world millions. Not more than 95 went through the process. But the pain was still alive and well. It took the courage of the Rwandese people to remind us Africans that within our jurisprudence, there are methods of healing. That is how the Gacaca courts were created. 12,000 village courts in Rwanda, in order not only to punish but to rehabilitate. While Rwanda may have done 95, Gacaca did nearly 1,900,000. Communities starting to heal. Perhaps one of the lessons that we should learn today, that even in times of sorrow, there can be wisdom, and that wisdom is Rwandese wisdom, it is African wisdom. So today, even as we talk about the pain that was visited upon the Tutsi in Rwanda, we must remind ourselves that this is the time to give pride of place and meaning to African jurisprudence. I look forward to scholars present in this assembly who will look at the Gacaca system and ask themselves what it is that we can borrow from Gacaca, which is African and which is Afrocentric and which is authentic, rather than embracing our minds in neo-colonial systems which we inherited from the former colonizers. I hope that on an occasion such as this, we'll have the courage to do so. I also know that this is an occasion to remind the international community that it is not the function of the international community to issue diktats, whether those diktats are issued from New York or from Nairobi or from Geneva without understanding the circumstances. It is the duty of the international community to ask itself the critical question, what can we do to ensure that we never have another genocide? It is the duty of the international community and the regional organization such as the East African communities, that is not the function of bodies such as these to merely pontificate, but to engage in activities that will ensure that the population is animated positively to remember that meaning must be given to that famous statement by the carpenter of Nazareth that you must take care of your neighbor. It is my wish, therefore, that those who are from the international community and are present here will ensure that we use this occasion to remind ourselves that we have a solemn duty to give meaning to the words that are to be found in all the holy books, whether you read the Muslim Quran or the Christian Bible or the Jewish Torah or the Hindu Bhagavad Gita, or you are a votary of African traditional religion. There is always this dictation that we should be keepers of our brothers and sisters, and this injunction that thou shalt not kill, that thou shalt not have an eye for an eye, because an eye for an eye only makes the world blind, as was said by Mohandas Karamchand Gandhi. I also hope that we remind ourselves that we are living in dangerous times. You know, in 1994, I was alive and well. I was an adult. I had graduated from this university. And I remember the voices. I remember the occasions when we were in the streets with the desire to awaken the spirit of the leadership in the world. But they were paralyzed. They were numbed. Those who could listen would listen to radio, television, music calling, saying what they were saying, asking people to rise up and to use machetes and other crude weapons, and use them they did. The radio was used. The medium of communication was used. People died. As I've said earlier, churches became slaughterhouses. It was not turning the other cheek, but using the other fist in churches. We are today in the era of artificial intelligence. Today, it would be quicker. Today, in the days of fake news, in the days of Instagram, in the days of WhatsApp, in the days of all these things, if the genocidaire wanted to commit genocide, they would do it in the twinkling of an eye. Today, they would use drones. So it is an occasion to remind ourselves that even as we embrace technology, let us ask ourselves, how are we going to use and deploy technology going forward? But you see, is it not that famous European called René Descartes who said, cogito ergo sum, I think, therefore I am. But how do you think? What is resident in your mind? We are here to remind ourselves that when human beings choose to do the wrong thing, there is suffering. That is why we are assembled here, ladies and gentlemen, to remind ourselves, never again. That is why we are here to remind ourselves that in times of adversity, the voices of reason must rise up. And that is why here, Your Excellency, we are also here to acknowledge the people of Rwanda. You know, after 100 days, the pessimists were eloquent. They had written Rwanda's obituary. They said of Rwanda it would never rise again. But a few brave Rwandese, led by His Excellency Paul Kagame, entered the country, did what they had to do, cleaned up Kigali, where bodies were littered. They went into the villages, cleaned it up, set up a government, started the process of rebuilding. Rwanda, like the phoenix, rose from our ashes. Today, permit me this latitude, with the Genocide Memorial Museum, Rwanda has become a mecca for those who want to see how things are organized. If you want to see how roads ought to be built, you go to Kigali. If you want to see how roundabouts are manicured, you go to Kigali. If you want to move away from the disorder of border borders to be found in Kampala and Nairobi, you go to Kigali. If you want to see policemen that reject your money when you want to corrupt them, you go to Kigali. If you want to see how football stadia and how basketball pitches are built within time and within budget, you go to Kigali. Kigali has become our pride, and when you go to Kigali and you want to see how technology is being used to good effect, you go to Kigali. That is how Kigali has risen, and that has happened within 32 years. Those who were born in 1994 are alive and well, and we have something to say about Kigali. So even as we are sitting here today, we cannot allow ourselves the luxury of being sad. Sadness is for the weak. The strong must be strong. That is why I'm glad to be present in this assembly. Glad knowing that revisionists and denialists will never find a pride of place. Their chance of survival is like the chance of a snowball in hell. That is why I'm happy to be here, because the international community, I pray and hope, will liberate ourselves from schizophrenia and epilepsy, so that they'll be able to ensure that not again will we have what we saw. That is why I'm happy to be here, knowing as I do that the African spirit has now been awakened, and that going forward we'll do what we must do. That is why I'm here and happy to know that because we have immortalized all these things in history, there'll always be a point of reference. And when the genocidaires come again, we shall stop them in their track. I'm happy to be here, and I'm happy to be with you in the knowledge, as was said by the famous Samora Machel, a luta continua, victoria er setta. Thank you.